Lydia Barrow was 20 years old the winter her mother traded her away, and she did not know, walking into the town of Coldwater at her mother's side through the dirty, trodden snow, that she would walk out of it belonging to someone else, for her mother had not seen fit to warn her. Maud Barrow had said only that they had business in town, and had kept her thin face turned forward the whole cold walk in, and had not met her daughter's eyes once, and Lydia, who had spent 20 years learning the weather of her mother's moods, had felt the wrongness of it in her stomach like a swallowed stone, but had not guessed the shape of it, because there are some things a daughter cannot let herself guess about the woman who bore her, not until they are done and cannot be undone. They had been poor since Lydia's father died, poor and getting poorer, the little hardscrabble farm failing acre by acre, and there had been a debt. There was always a debt, and the debt was owed to Silas Kroll, who owned the saloon and the freight line, and, by way of the money he lent at ruinous interest, a good half of the souls in Coldwater besides. Kroll was a big, brutal, iron-haired man with cold, flat eyes and a broken nose, and a way of looking at a woman that made her want to cover herself, and he had been looking at Lydia Barrow that way across the Mercantile and the church steps for 2 years now, since she was 18, and Maud Barrow had seen him looking. And Maud Barrow. When Kroll had made her a certain proposition regarding the crushing debt she could not pay, had turned it over in her frightened, selfish heart for exactly one sleepless night before she said yes. So that when they came to the boardwalk before Kroll's saloon and the big man came out into the cold to meet them with his cruel, satisfied smile, and Maud Barrow took her daughter's arm and drew her forward and said, in a voice gone high and strange, "Here she is. Then, Mr. Kroll, as we agreed, and you'll call the debt square, all of it, in writing, mind." Lydia did not, for one long moment, understand. She looked at the smiling brute reaching for her, and she looked at her mother's face turned away, and she felt the ground of her whole life tilt and slide, and she said, "Mama? Mama, what does he mean, as you agreed? Mama, look at me. What have you done?" "Don't make a scene, Lydia," her mother said, low and quick, still not looking at her, already stepping back, already counting the freedom of a debt forgiven. "It's a good match. He's a man of property. You'll want for nothing. It's more than I could ever give you. Be sensible now," and she pried her own daughter's fingers from her sleeve, and she stepped back again out of reach, and Silas Kroll's heavy hand closed around Lydia's arm with the sureness of a man taking possession of a thing he has bought and paid for, and Lydia understood at last, all at once, the whole of it, that her mother had sold her to settle a debt, had traded her own living daughter to a cruel man like a heifer led to market, and had not even had the courage or the love to tell her first. The betrayal of it went through Lydia like a blade, so deep and so cold that she could not even weep, could only stand there in the snow with the brute's hand hot on her arm, and stare at the back of her mother's retreating bonnet, and feel something in her that had trusted the world break clean in two, and never, she knew even then, fully mend. "You'll come inside now, girl," Kroll said, low, pleased, his grip tightening, drawing her toward the saloon door. "We've a deal to seal and a preacher paid to seal it, and no more foolishness. You're mine now, fair bought. Best you learn to like it." And across the snowy street, a grieving man set down the sack he was carrying. Jonah Creed had not meant to be in Coldwater that day, and would not have been, but that his old hand Eli had bullied him into it, saying a man could not live on grief and black coffee forever, and the ranch wanted flour whether Jonah wanted living or not. So Jonah had come down off Sabbath Ridge for the first time in the 2 months since he had buried his wife, come down a hollow ghost of the man he'd been, moving through the world with the particular deadness of the newly bereaved. seeing nothing, wanting nothing. A big, dark, grieving shape loading flour onto a wagon and counting the minutes until he could go back up the mountain to the empty house where at least he did not have to watch other people go on living. He had heard the commotion across the street the way you hear something through deep water, distant and muffled. And then he had looked up. And he had seen the girl. He had seen her face at the moment it broke, had seen the exact instant a young woman understood that her own mother had sold her, and something in that face reached through the gray wall of Jonah Creed's grief and took hold of him where nothing had been able to reach him in 2 months. For Jonah knew that face. It was the face of someone learning that the person who was supposed to love and protect them above all others had failed them utterly and forever. And Jonah, who had knelt in the snow 2 months back and watched them lower everything he loved into the frozen ground and felt the whole world go faithless and cruel, knew that particular species of ruin from the inside, and could not, it turned out, watch it happen to another living soul and do nothing. He set down the sack. He did not decide to. His grief-numbed body simply set it down and began to cross the street, and by the time his stunned mind caught up to what he was doing, he was already standing on the boardwalk before Silas Kroll, big and dark and terrible in his long drover's coat. And every hard man on that street had gone quiet to watch. "Let go of her arm," Jonah said. Kroll looked him over, and knew him. Everyone knew the Creed place, the Good Horse ranch up on the ridge, and knew its owner had lost his wife and gone to ground with his grief, and Kroll smiled his cold smile. "This is no affair of yours, Creed. Go bury your dead. The girl's a debt paid, all legal. Her mother's mark on the paper. She's mine. She's not a debt," Jonah said. "She's not a horse, nor a sack of flour, nor a thing to be bought. And no paper her mother signed makes a free woman property, not in this territory nor any other, whatever you've got the sheriff believing." His haunted gray eyes went to Lydia, held her wide, dark, frightened ones a moment. "Steady, whatever's owed, I'll pay it. Right now, in gold, twice over. And then the girl walks free, and if she wants to walk away from the both of us, she can, and if she wants my protection, she'll have it, but she's nobody's property, and you'll take your hand off her this second, Kroll, or I'll take it off for you." The street had gone very still. Silas Kroll was not a man accustomed to being crossed, and there was a moment, a long, dangerous moment, when his hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip and the whole thing might have ended in blood right there in the snow. But Jonah Creed did not flinch, did not so much as blink, and there is a thing that grief does to a man that Kroll, for all his cruelty, was wise enough to recognize and fear. It makes him unafraid to die. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in any street, and Kroll looked into Jonah Creed's dead, calm eyes and saw a man who genuinely did not care whether he walked away from this, and Kroll, who cared very much for his own comfortable life, took his hand off the girl. "Pay it, then," he spat, "and be damned to you both. But this ain't finished, Creed. That girl was promised to me. I don't forget a debt, and I don't forget a slight, and a grieving man who thinks he's got nothing to lose had best remember he's got a ranch and a hired hand and now a girl to lose, if he's fool enough to make an enemy of me over another man's leavings." And he named a sum, an enormous, cruel sum, far more than the debt could truly be. And Jonah Creed counted it out in gold onto the boardwalk without a word, and without haggling, every coin, and Silas Kroll scooped it up and went back into his saloon, and the danger passed for that day. Lydia stood free in the snow, trembling. Her mother was gone, had slipped away in the confrontation, taking her forgiven dead and her cowardice with her, not even a backward glance for the daughter she'd sold, and Lydia was alone in a hard town with a strange, grieving giant who had just paid a fortune for her freedom, and she did not know whether she had been rescued or merely purchased by a gentler hand, and she was too shocked to ask. "I'll not hold you to anything," Jonah said, low, seeming to read the fear in her. "You heard me tell him true. You're free, the money's nothing to me, I'd not miss it, and it bought you loose, not bought you. If you've somewhere to go, Ken, that's decent, I'll see you safely to them, and that's the end of it." He looked at her, and something old and sad moved in his gray eyes. "But if you've nowhere, and I reckon a woman whose own mother would do such a thing hasn't got a soft place to land, then I'll tell you what I can offer, and it isn't much, and it comes with grief attached, so hear me out before you judge it. Kroll won't let this lie. You heard him. A woman alone in this country he could take again, quiet, some night, and no law would trouble him. But a married woman on a man's own land with a man ready to stand for her that he'd think twice about. I lost my wife 2 months back. I'll not pretend to you I've a whole heart to offer, for I haven't, it's in the ground on my ridge, and like to stay there. But I've a warm house and good land, and I'll stand between you and that animal till one of us is dead. And I'll ask nothing of you a husband's got no right to ask. Marry me. Not for love, I've none left to give just now, and you've had a belly full of folk who claim to love you, but for safety. Let me do one decent thing in a year that's held nothing but dying." And Lydia Barrow, sold by her own mother not an hour past, looked up into the ravaged, grieving face of the stranger who had crossed a street to save her, and understood that he was offering her not love, which she no longer believed in, but something she found in that moment she wanted far more, which was to be fought for. No one had ever fought for Lydia. Her mother had traded her away without a fight, the world had used her hard, and here was a broken man with nothing left, who had walked into a gun's reach for a girl he'd never met, and was offering to keep standing between her and harm. "You don't even know me," she said. "No," Jonah agreed. "But I know what it is to have the ground drop out from under you, and I know I can't put you back on that boardwalk." So he held out one big scarred hand. "It's a poor, cold bargain, Lydia Barrow, but every word of it's honest." She took his hand. It was the first warm thing she had touched all that terrible day. They were married that afternoon by the same preacher Kroll had paid, who married them instead with only a little nervousness, and they rode up to Sabbath Ridge in the blue cold dusk, and Lydia saw for the first time the place that was to be her home, a fine weathered ranch house, and a great barn and corrals of good horses standing patient in the snow. A prosperous place, a place that should have been full of life. But it was not full of life. It was a house of mourning, and Lydia felt it the moment she stepped through the door. The stopped clock, the cold hearth, the thick dust, the terrible stillness of a home where someone has stopped caring whether they live or die. A dead woman's blue shawl still lay folded over the back of a chair by the cold fireplace where its owner had left it. A shaggy black and white collie lay by the hearth with its head on its paws, and it lifted mournful eyes to Lydia and did not rise, a dog pining itself to death for a mistress who was not coming back. And the old hand Eli, who came in from the barn to meet her, looked at Lydia with such naked relief and hope in his weathered face that she understood at once she was not merely a wife brought home. She was, to this grieving household, the first sign of spring after a killing winter, and they none of them, man nor dog, had believed spring would ever come again. Jonah gave her the good bedroom and made up the small one off the kitchen for himself, exactly as he'd promised, asking nothing. And Lydia, who had come to that ridge with nothing but a cloth bundle and a broken heart, looked around the dead cold house of her grieving husband and found to her own surprise that she was not afraid, and was not even sorry. She had spent her life being told she was a burden, a mouth, a thing to be traded off, and here was a whole household drowning, a man and an old cowhand and a heartsick dog, and every one of them needed exactly the thing Lydia Barrow had always had in abundance and never once been valued for, which was the stubborn will to make a broken place livable. She would not try to be the woman whose shawl lay on that chair, but she could light the cold hearth, she could feed the pining dog by hand until it ate, she could sweep out the terrible stillness and let a little living back into that house. And so, quietly, without announcing it on the very first evening, Lydia Barrow set down her bundle and rolled up her sleeves and began. The bringing of that house back to life was slow work, the work of weeks, and Lydia did it gently, careful of the grief that lived in every corner. She did not move the blue shawl. She dusted around it, worked around it, left it exactly where its owner's hand had left it, and Jonah noticed that she left it, and something eased in him a very little to see that the new life coming into his house was not going to trample the old. She fed the collie, Shep, by hand, coaxing it back from the edge, and within a fortnight the dog had transferred its whole pining loyalty to Lydia, and followed her everywhere, and the sight of the dog alive again did something to Jonah he could not have put words to. She learned the work of the place from old Eli, who was so glad of her he'd have taught her to fly. And she was good with the horses, unafraid and gentle, and Jonah, watching her from the barn door with the green mare that had been his dead wife's favorite, felt the ice around his heart give one dangerous crack, and hated himself for it, and could not stop it. For that was Jonah's private war, all that winter, and Lydia came to understand it and to grieve it with him, that as the warmth of her slowly thawed him back toward the land of the living, he felt it as a betrayal of the woman in the ground. Every time Lydia made him smile, every time the sight of her by his fire eased the great stone on his chest, some part of Jonah Creed cried out that he had no right, that to heal was to forget, that to feel the smallest gladness in this new woman's presence was to be false to the wife he had sworn to love forever. He held himself back from Lydia with a fierce, guilty discipline, kind always but walled, and Lydia, who knew a thing or two now about walls, did not push against it. She only kept the house warm, and kept the dog fed, and kept being present, steady and undemanding, and let the man fight his war in his own time, and trusted, for she had begun, despite everything, to trust again that the ice would break when it was ready and not before. There was one evening that turned the season, though neither of them knew it at the time. A hard blow had come down off the peaks and shut them in, and old Eli had gone to his bunk in the barn, and Jonah and Lydia sat alone on either side of the great blazing hearth with the storm loud on the roof, and for a long while neither spoke. And then Jonah, staring into the fire, began of his own accord to talk of Susanna. He had not spoken her name aloud to a living soul since the burying. But he spoke it now, haltingly and then in a low, steady flood, all of it, how they'd met, how she'd laughed, the horse she'd loved, the child they'd hoped for and not had, the 4 terrible days of the fever, the way the house had died with her. Lydia did not interrupt him. She did not offer comfort or counsel or any of the useless things people say. She only sat quiet in the firelight and let him empty out the grief he'd been carrying alone for 2 months, her dark eyes on his face, present and unflinching. And when at last he ran dry and sat spent and shaking a little in his chair, she rose and crossed to him, and, greatly daring, laid one hand on his bowed shoulder, just that, and left it there. And Jonah Creed reached up without looking and covered her small hand with his big scarred one and held it hard against his shoulder, and the two of them stayed like that a long while, not speaking, while the fire burned down and the storm howled itself out, two broken people keeping a broken vigil, and it was the closest either of them had been to another human soul in a very long time. "I'm sorry," Jonah said at last, hoarse. "I've no call to lay all that on you." "You've every call," Lydia said softly. Grief kept in the dark just festers. My grandmother used to say a sorrow spoken is a sorrow halved. She pressed his shoulder. "You can give me the half. I've broad enough shoulders for it. Lord knows you've carried enough of mine already." And Jonah looked up at her then, really looked, and something in his ravaged face began, at last, to heal. She learned his Susanna from Eli in the barn, the way you learn the dead, a good woman, kind and laughing, dead of a fever that came on sudden in the autumn and took her in a week, despite everything Jonah did. 4 hard days' ride from any doctor. "He wasn't always like this," the old man said, forking hay, his eyes wet. "Fullest of life of any man I knew. She was the light of him, and when she went out, he went out too. I've watched him these 2 months just waiting to die, near as I can tell, and not a thing I could do. And then he comes down off this mountain the one day in 60 I could shame him into it, and there you are in the street about to be handed to that devil Kroll," and the old man shook his head. "I don't hold with saying such things, missy, but I'll say it the once. My Susanna's in heaven, and I believe she saw that girl in the street, and I believe she reached down and put her hand on the back of Jonah's neck and turned his head. Because that man was never going to cross a street for himself again, but he crossed it for you." Lydia had to lean against a stall a moment. At that, she had spent her whole life feeling she was worth nothing to anyone, and here was an old man telling her that a dead woman in heaven had thought her worth saving her grieving husband for. And then the winter, which had given them their fragile mending peace, took it away again, for Silas Kroll had not forgotten. And Silas Kroll was not a man to be crossed in the street before the whole town and simply swallow it. He came up Sabbath Ridge on a hard, bright, bitter morning near the end of that winter, and he did not come alone. He came with 4 hired men, hard cases from his freight line, all of them armed, riding up the snowy trail toward the ranch with the plain intent of taking back what he considered his, and teaching the grieving fool who'd shamed him a lesson the whole valley would hear about. Lydia saw them first, from the kitchen window, 5 dark riders coming up the white trail, and her blood went to ice and she called for Jonah. And here the grieving man, who had been waiting all winter to die, discovered that he wanted, with a sudden fierce clarity that astonished him, to live, and more than that, to see that Lydia Barrow lived, whatever it cost him. He did not panic. He put Lydia behind him, and he sent Eli to the barn for the rifles, and he stepped out onto his own porch to meet the riders as they came into the yard. And when Silas Kroll drew rein and opened his cruel mouth to make his demands, Jonah Creed spoke first, and his voice was not the dead gray voice of a mourning man. It was something harder and more alive than anything Lydia had yet heard from him. "You're on my land, Kroll," he said. "The woman behind me is my wife, married lawful, and the only way you take her off this ridge is dead. Over my body and old Eli's both, and you'll notice Eli's got a rifle on your lead man right now, and another on you, and I've watched that old man shoot the eye out of a running coyote at 200 yards. Now you brought 4 guns up my mountain thinking to frighten a broken man who didn't care to live. But I've had a change of heart these past weeks, Kroll, and I find I care to live very much. And a man who's just remembered he wants to live will fight harder than any man you ever met. Harder than your paid dogs who are only in it for wages and are right now doing the sums on whether you're worth dying for. I don't believe you are. I don't believe they believe it either. So here's my offer, and it's the last words I'll waste on you. Turn around. Ride down. Never come up this ridge again, nor trouble my wife, nor anyone she loves, and we'll all of us live to see the spring. Or reach for that gun, and let's find out together how many of you I take with me. Your choice. But make it quick, for it's cold, and I've a warm house to get back to. There was a long, terrible, held silence in the snowy yard. Kroll's hired men shifted in their saddles and looked at old Eli's steady rifle and looked at the terrible alive certainty in Jonah Creed's face and did their sums and found the answer wanting. One of them, then another, let his hand drift wide of his gun. And Silas Kroll, who was cruel but not stupid, and who could feel his hired courage evaporating around him in the cold, understood that he had badly misjudged the temper of the man he'd come to break, and that pressing it now would likely get him killed for a girl and a grudge, and Silas Kroll cared for nothing in this world so much as his own hide. His face worked with fury. But he yanked his horse's head around. "Keep her, then," he snarled. "Keep the little," and he said a foul word, and Jonah took one step forward off the porch, and Kroll flinched to spite himself and did not finish it, and spurred his horse and rode down off Sabbath Ridge with his hired men trailing after. And this time Lydia knew, watching them dwindle against the snow, that he would not be back, for a bully deprived of his fear has nothing left to spend. And the whole valley would hear by nightfall how Kroll's 4 guns had turned tail before one grieving rancher and an old man, and Silas Kroll would not survive that telling as a power in cold water. It was, in its way, the end of him. Jonah stood in the yard a long moment after they had gone, and then he turned and he looked at Lydia standing in the doorway of his house, his wife, whom he had married for her safety and not for love, whom he had walled himself away from all that guilty winter, and something broke open in his ravaged face at last, the ice going out of it all at once like a river in spring. And he crossed the snowy yard to her, and he took her face in his 2 big scarred hands, careful as if she were made of glass. "I told you I'd nothing left to give," he said, rough and unsteady, "that my heart was in the ground and like to stay there. I believed it, Lydia. 2 months I'd been waiting to follow Susanna into the dark, and I'd have gone gladly. And then I saw your face in that street, and I crossed it, and I told myself it was only decency, only doing one last good thing before the dark took me." He shook his head slowly, his gray eyes wet and alive. "But that's not what it was. I've fought it all winter, and I'm done fighting it, for I near watched Kroll take you just now, and I found there's not enough grief in the world to make me willing to lose you. You've brought me back from the dead, woman, fed my dog and lit my fire and thawed me out and given a used-up grieving man a reason to want the morning again. That's not a debt. That's not safety. That's the thing I swore I'd never feel again, and I feel it. God help me, I feel it clean through." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Susanna would have loved you. I know it the way I know my own name. Loving you doesn't betray her, it's the only way left to honor her, for she'd never have wanted me in that grave, and it took a girl her own mother threw away to haul me out of it. You are worth fighting for, Lydia Barrow, worth living for. I'd cross that street 1,000 times. Only don't ask me to keep to that little room off the kitchen anymore, for I can't do it. Not now I know what you are." And Lydia Barrow, who an hour before her wedding had learned that she was worth nothing at all to the woman who bore her, stood in the snowy yard of a horse ranch with a grieving man's warm hands framing her face, and understood that she had been wrong about the world, that it was not all faithlessness and trade and betrayal, that there was this too, this fierce, alive tenderness, this being chosen and kept and fought for, and she began to weep at last, the tears she had been too shocked to weep on that boardwalk, only these were another kind entirely. My own mother sold me for a debt. She wept, laughing through it, and I thought that meant I was worthless. And then a broken stranger paid a fortune to set me free and married me to keep me safe and stood down 5 guns on his own porch rather than let me go. I know exactly what I'm worth now, Jonah Creed. You taught me. You're the one taught me." And she reached up and took hold of him the way she had wanted to for weeks, and the collie Shep barked and circled them in the snow, and old Eli, watching from the barn, took off his battered hat and pressed it to his chest and looked up at the hard bright sky and said, "Quiet. You did that, Susanna. You reached down and you did that," and had to wipe his old eyes on his sleeve. They did not move the blue shawl, not ever. It stayed folded on its chair by the hearth all the long good years that followed, and neither of them ever spoke of moving it, for it belonged there, a part of the house's history and Jonah's heart, and Lydia would no more have removed it than she'd have torn out a page of a book she loved. But around it, the house came all the way back to life. The clock ran again. The hearth blazed. In time there were children on Sabbath Ridge, and the corrals were full, and the Creed place became known through the whole valley not as the house where a man had gone to die, but as the warmest, liveliest ranch on the mountain. And Silas Kroll drifted out of Coldwater within the year, his power broken, and Maud Barrow, Lydia saw her but once more, years on, thin and old and begging at a church door, and Lydia, who had every right to pass her by, stopped and pressed money into her mother's hand, and said only, "I forgive you, Mama, for my own sake and not for yours, because I'll not carry your betrayal around any longer than I already have," and walked on, and never saw her again, and found she was lighter for it. For Lydia had learned the truest thing there is to know in this hard and faithless world, that where you come from, and who threw you away, need not be the measure of what you are worth, for a soul is not worth what its own kin will trade it for, but what a good heart will cross a street and stand down 5 guns and come back from the very grave itself to fight for. And by that measure, and it is the only true one, Lydia Barrow, sold for a debt on a snowy boardwalk, was worth a whole warm world. She had walked into Coldwater at her mother's side that winter morning, belonging to no one and valued by none, certain in her secret heart that she was a burden the world would always be glad to be rid of. She walked the rest of her long life knowing better. For she had been thrown away by the one who ought to have held her dearest, and picked up out of the snow by a stranger who owed her nothing at all, and in the difference between those two truths she had found the whole meaning of her days, that love is not the thing you are born owed, but the thing that crosses the street for you when it has every reason not to, and stays, and fights, and never once lets go.